As a financial planner who's helped hundreds of individuals and couples approach and transition to retirement, I'm constantly looking for new ways to help people get the most out of life as well as their retirement savings. This includes reevaluating traditional strategies and rules of thumb that so many people default to when implementing their own plan. In this video, I wanted to show you 4 critical flaws in the 4% rule that so many people use to determine how much they can safely spend in retirement, as well as my alternative solution and why I believe it's a better one. Hey everyone, if we haven't met yet, my name is Jake Skellhorn. I'm a certified financial planner and the co-founder of Spark Wealth Advisors, where we help people across the country retire with confidence and clarity. First and foremost, I'm not here to completely bash the 4% rule. I do like how simple it is to calculate how much you can safely spend from your portfolio each year, or if you reverse engineer it, you can figure out how much you need to save up to spend what you want in retirement. So anytime there's a rule of thumb or a tool that makes it easier for the masses to increase their financial literacy, I think that's a win. Now, with that said, I think a lot of people who have heard of the 4% rule don't completely understand the nuances to it. So let's cover the basic facts about the 4% rule before we go into my critiques of it. So the 4% rule says that a retiree can safely spend 4% of the beginning balance of their portfolio at retirement and adjust that amount upwards for inflation each year with a near 100% probability of not running out of money over a 30-year time period. It does not mean that you can take 4% of your portfolio balance at the start of each year, which is a common misconception. So again, for example, if you have $1 million on the day that you retire, you take out $40,000 in year one, and then no matter what your portfolio does after that, you take $40,000 and increase it for inflation based on CPI the year before. It also assumes a 30-year time period for retirement and that your portfolio is invested in a 60-40 portfolio, 60% in US large cap stocks and 40% in US intermediate term treasuries. So the first flaw, or my first critique of the 4% rule, is that I think it's overly conservative. So the rule's founder or author, William Bengen, found that 4% was essentially the safe withdrawal rate that you could take out from your portfolio and be able to withstand all the various market crashes and recessions that happened historically. If you look back through the actual paper that he wrote, there were plenty of periods that you could have actually withdrawn 5 or 6 or more percent each year over a 30-year period and still not run out of money. But so 4% was basically founded on the worst possible scenario based on historic market events. To help visualize this, we can look at research from Michael Kitces, who is a renowned thought leader in the financial planning industry. So here's a chart of backtesting the 4% safe withdrawal rule, starting with $1 million. Each of these lines represents a portfolio balance using the 4% rule, starting retirement in a given year from 1871 to, I believe, 1975 was the time range. So that's give or take about 100 years of backtesting this. Even though in none of these backtests does the portfolio go to zero or does the retiree run out of money, but in the vast majority of them, they have an ending balance that's more than the starting principal. In other words, you're ending your life with more money than you even started retirement. So that goes back to it being overly conservative. A couple more stats. The median outcome, which is going to be somewhere in the middle here, resulted in a balance that was more than 2.8 times the starting balance. So if you start retirement with $1 million, the median outcome, according to this back test, is that you're going to have about $2.8 million even after spending 4% of your portfolio each year. And over 2/3 of the outcomes result in a ending balance that's more than double what you started with. So basically, there's a 66% chance that you're going to end up with more than double what you started with after a 30-year period. It's really not hard to understand why this is the case, because the historical average return of a 60-40 portfolio that the rule uses is about 8%. So if you're only withdrawing 4% and your portfolio is growing at 8%, it's easy to see why you might end up with more money in the end. The second flaw with the 4% rule is that it assumes 100% of your retirement savings is in pre-tax accounts like 401ks and IRAs, when in reality, a lot of the people that I've spoken to and worked with have a mix of both pre-tax Roth money and after-tax money, like a brokerage account. So having multiple different buckets to pull from in retirement can really affect your spending power and ultimately your tax liability. So the other thing that the 4% rule doesn't consider, which I'll lump into this same flaw, is that it doesn't account for taxes at all. So ironically, it assumes all your money is in pre-tax accounts, but doesn't factor in the taxes owed when you take those withdrawals. Obviously, everyone's tax situation is going to be a little bit different, but having all your money in a pre-tax account would mean that every time you take a withdrawal, you're paying taxes at your highest marginal tax rate. For example, if you have $1 million saved for retirement and you estimate your expenses to be $40,000 per year, you might think you have enough, but once you withdraw that money, it might look closer to $30,000 to $35,000 after taxes. So again, you want to make sure that you understand this if you are planning on relying on this rule. If you've seen any of my videos before, you know I'm a big fan of saving money in a taxable brokerage account for that ultimate flexibility in retirement when you're in that drawdown phase. You can really control how much taxes you owe by pulling different amounts of money from different accounts. Again, those long-term capital gains tax rates can be as low as 0% in a taxable brokerage account. So if you have a one-off expense, you can potentially pull it from there as opposed to your IRA. And then obviously the Roth bucket is going to be tax-free as well. So that's the second flaw with the 4% rule. It assumes all your money is in pre-tax accounts and it doesn't factor in what your taxes might be when you withdraw it. Before we move on to the next one, if you're enjoying this video so far, be sure to like it and subscribe to the channel for any future videos. The third and maybe the biggest flaw in my opinion is that it assumes a linear spending throughout retirement. So again, if you take out 4% of your portfolio each year and adjust it for inflation, that is assuming that you're going to spend the exact same amount of money every single year in retirement without any changes or adjustments, when there are countless studies to show that that's simply not the case. A better approach, known as the retirement spending smile or retirement spending stages, a lot of people put it as. Initial years of retirement, known as the go-go years, typically comes with higher spending as you've put off things like travel and leisure. The middle stage of retirement, known as the slow-go years, usually involves a lower spending on an inflation-adjusted basis as you settle into more of a routine and maybe become less mobile, travel less. And then towards the end, your expenses typically pick up again with more healthcare related expenses. The same subject, the 4% rule also doesn't take into consideration any other income sources you have or any one-off expenses like an unexpected home repair. Say you plan to retire at 65, but you want to delay Social Security until 70. Well, what if you need more than 4% of your portfolio for those first 5 years, and then after that you need less than 4%? The 4% rule has no rules or direction for situations like that. And on the other side of the equation, the 4% rule also has no sort of guidance or direction if you have an unexpected expense that causes you to withdraw more than 4% of your portfolio in a given year. So let's say you have a budget of $40,000 and that turns out to be that 4%. But you have a roof repair that you need to do 1 year and that costs $20,000. All of a sudden your withdrawal rate is now 6%. What do you do next year? Do you lower it? Do you continue to take out 4%? Again, the 4% rule doesn't have any guidance around inconsistent income sources or expenses. The fourth flaw with the 4% rule is that it assumes a 60-40 portfolio. Again, that 60-40 is made up of 60% in US large cap stocks, which could be indicative of the S&P 500, for example, and then 40% in US intermediate term treasuries. So while this isn't the worst portfolio I can think of, it's certainly not the most diversified. Obviously, if you've been watching the stock market over any part of the last 15 years or so, you know that US large cap stocks have done fairly well. Over a longer time period, such as retirement, like 30 plus years, you generally want to be more diversified. So take a look at this chart that shows the different asset classes and which perform the best and worst on a given year. As you can see, it's all over the place. There's really no sort of consistency showing which sector typically performs the best. So by having a globally diversified portfolio among small, medium, and large sized companies, you really kind of reduce the risk of your portfolio in most cases and take advantage of the sector of the market that's going to provide the best returns in a given year. So now that we've discussed that, let's get into the alternative solution and why I think it's a better way to approach retirement spending. So this solution I'm referring to is known as the Guardrails spending strategy. So what Guardrails does is it aims to prevent underspending as well as overspending. So overspending would be, running out of money before you die, and underspending would be dying with a huge pile of cash in the bank. The way it does this is that it sets parameters for when you can increase your spending or decrease your spending based on the performance of your portfolio. So going back to that initial critique of the 4% rule being too conservative, the reason for that is, historically speaking, your portfolio is going to continue growing throughout retirement. So with the guardrail strategy, as your portfolio increases in value, it allows you to increase your income accordingly. Let's take a look at an example using our financial planning software Income Lab to show you exactly what I mean. So a quick background on our example set of clients here. These are not real clients. They are made up, as you might have seen in another video, but we have John and Jane, who are both 65 years old, and they have about $1.5 million saved for retirement. I use this number because that is what the average American thinks they need saved for retirement based on a recent survey. I'll include a link to a recent video I did on that. So first and foremost, let's just break down where their accounts are. So we have John's IRA pre-tax with about $800,000, Jane's 401k also pre-tax about $320,000, And then they also have Jane's Roth IRA, and then they have a taxable brokerage account. That's a little bit about their situation. If John and Jane were to retire today, let's take a look at what their income guardrails would suggest that they can spend. It's also important to note that John and Jane have Social Security benefits that will kick in at 67. Just to keep it simple for this video, we're not going to go into any timing strategies for that, but they'll each earn $2,500 a month for Social Security at full retirement age. So take a look at their dashboard to show how much they can afford to spend from a $1.5 million portfolio. So with their starting balance at $1.46 million, John and Jane are able to spend an estimated $10,746 before taxes from their portfolio each month. So that's over $120,000. Obviously much more than the 4% rule would suggest, which is about $60,000, but you'll see in just a moment that this also incorporates Social Security later down the line. And the purpose of guardrails is to prevent both overspending and underspending. So you can see that if their portfolio were to continue growing and reach a $1.6 million balance, they could safely increase their spending to $11,800 per month until it hits the next guardrail. To look into this in more detail, we can see that that would be ultimately a 10% increase in their current portfolio balance. Again, this is while withdrawing money. And on the downside, you can see there's a much larger buffer. So in other words, there's a much lower chance that they're going to have to reduce their spending. That's not something that anyone really wants to have to do in retirement. But you can see this essentially would mean a 23% drop in their portfolio before they would have to cut spending. And they would only have to cut spending 5% or so to really preserve their portfolio and reduce the possibility of running out of money. Guardrails is also customizable depending on your unique risk tolerance and how comfortable you are with the possibility of increasing or decreasing spending. So down here, you can set more conservative parameters, which would be, lower starting spending, but a lower chance of adjusting that spending. So that moves their current balance closer to that upper guardrail. So they would have to experience a 28% decrease in their portfolio before they would have to adjust spending downwards by just 5%. But again, historically speaking, it's more likely that the portfolio is going to continue to grow over time. So if their portfolio were to increase 5% at this setting, they can increase their spending 5% as well. So let's address some of the critiques that we talked about with the 4% rule and how guardrails is a better solution for each of those subject areas. So first one being that it's too conservative, right? So the 4% rule usually results in you dying with more money than you even started with in retirement. So the solution to that in guardrails is, again, increasing your spending as your portfolio increases in value, which is historically likely. So to test the outcome of the guardrail strategy, we can go to this legacy tab here. If you recall from the study that Michael Kitces did, the median outcome of the 4% rule results in the ending balance of your portfolio 2.8 times what it started at. So in our example here, we started at 1.46 million. The median outcome using the 4% rule would be over $4 million. As you can see with guardrails, the median outcome would be an ending balance of about $480,000 using the settings and the balances and accounts in this example. In the worst case scenario, you still have $242,000 left, which is a pretty decent buffer that you wouldn't have to worry about running out of money in your final years. Again, this is using historical data and assuming that John and Jane live until age 95. Second critique, again, is that the 4% rule assumes everything is saved in pre-tax accounts. So for that, we can go back to John and Jane's situation here where they have money spread across multiple different account types. These are going to be their pre-tax accounts. So still the vast majority. By having money in their taxable brokerage account and a Roth IRA, again, they have the ability to pull from different accounts as needed in order to better control their tax bracket. So I find this to be a much more common allocation of how retirees have saved money rather than having 100% of their savings in pre-tax accounts. And the third critique was that the 4% rule assumes that you spend the same exact amount each year in retirement. So the guardrails response to that is that we assume that the retirement spending smile is a more accurate spending pattern among retirees. So as you can see, over time, expenses actually lower. And this is on an inflation adjusted basis. So it doesn't necessarily mean that John and Jane are going to take out $10,000 one month and then that month the following year, it's going to be $9,500. It just means it's not going to increase as much as inflation. So on an inflation adjusted basis, their spending does decrease over time. And then towards the end here, we will typically incorporate higher expenses for things like end of life care and long-term care expenses. But we do that on an individualized basis, which is why you don't see it increase back here. But the other thing, again, that the 4% rule doesn't incorporate is the timing of different cash flows like Social Security or those one-off expenses. So as you can see here in the first few years of their retirement before they're claiming Social Security, all of their money is coming from their portfolio withdrawals. So Social Security kicks in, less of the money will be needed from their portfolio, but their spending stays relatively the same. So again, another area where the 4% rule kind of lacks is taking into consideration these different cash flows and different timings of them. What I think this does a good job of illustrating is that even though they're taking out a high percentage of their portfolio in the first few years, they're taking out a much lower withdrawal rate later in their years, that it's still a sustainable amount. So, this ultimately comes out to probably 8% or so for the first couple of years. But since Social Security kicks in later, it's not a huge risk. And as long as they're able to adjust based on how the market's doing, that's not a real threat to the long-term viability of their plan. And the last thing, again, is that the 4% rule assumes that cookie cutter portfolio. So the approach that I like to take, and this isn't necessarily exclusive to Guardrails, but rather than taking a risk tolerance questionnaire and putting you in a cookie cutter portfolio, I prefer to designate a certain amount of years of expenses into risk investments like cash and bonds. Depending on how comfortable a particular retiree is, I would say anywhere between 5 and 7 years of expenses. So John and Jane's example, let's say that their essential expenses come out to about $60,000 per year after taxes. We would factor taxes into that and conservatively say maybe 75,000 is what they need to have gross. If they're comfortable having about 5 years of their expenses in low risk investments, that would come out to about 25% of their portfolio. So we would allocate about 25% to cash and bonds and then the rest into stocks. I think this is a much more personalized way of doing it since everyone's expenses are different. And the logic here is that if the stock market does have a significant downturn, you simply don't touch your stocks, then you take your money from your bonds and your cash for living expenses while the stocks recover. Historically speaking, the average bear market recovery takes, I think, less than 2 years. So even 5 years of expenses is pretty conservative while you allow those stocks to come back. So that's it for this video. I hope you learned something about the 4% rule and a potentially better strategy out there for you. One thing I didn't go into too much detail on with this case study today was things like Roth conversions, but I did make a video recently of a case study on Roth conversions. If you want to check that out now, here it is. Besides that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.